Oh wait, I'm just gonna this iPad to the semi-viewing chat, which I feel like might not be great. Yeah, okay, maybe if you can. Helpful, thank you.
Maybe just kick me out of the viewers chat just in case. I put it on Do Not Disturb so you shouldn't see anything. Yeah.
Yeah, it's on Do Not Disturb now, so it should be. Religion's conception of societal and political issues are often stuck in the past, and they force everyone in those states to be attached to those conservative ideals, but also, when those religions are involved in social and political views, it means that there's clashes between religions in a way that is really harmful. Two things in the speech. Firstly, on why religions systemically skew badly on these issues of social and political issues, and secondly, on why that leads to immense harms, both in terms of the way those religions clash when they do advocate for those things. Firstly, why they systemically skew bad. When I say bad, I think that means they're conservative socially. Firstly, both in terms of issues like, for example, gay rights or abortion or things like that. But secondarily, I think they're often conservative socially in a way where they benefit the interests of the rich over the interests of the poor and most vulnerable groups in society. And I'm going to explain that further as I go along. Why is this? Firstly, religions are just very old, right? In order to be an established religion, you have to have existed for a long time, and that is how you get legitimacy as a religion. I think that means that relative to basically any other social influence in society, a religion will necessarily be older and obviously have the important beliefs from an older period of society. And it's mostly going to be likely that they stay in that more conservative viewpoint. But this is especially the case because societies get more progressive over time. But religions, if you're based in an older conception, you're less likely to be able to be that progressive. Secondly, religions uniquely are resistant to change in a way that political movements are, because the way that religions validate themselves is the premise that there is an unchanging truth, which is much higher than all the other truths in society. So it means it's much more difficult for them to change, because they are attached to these ways, they're attached to things like the scripture, so it's much difficult for you to change your beliefs compared to other political movements which are able to be adapted over time in a much more different way. Thirdly, religion in and of itself, the purpose is a value judgment on society and how the world should be. And I think religion, when there is social and political issues, often when it's focused on that, it often shapes the way that society functions in the first instance. So the way that society exists is something which the religion has helped propagate over time, which means the poorest and most vulnerable people in society are the ones who have already been fucked over by the religion and just continues on that pathway, because they have to stick with what they were already saying. That looks like things like saying you are best able to go, if you give lots of money to the church, and if you aren't able to give lots of money to the church, then fuck you, we don't want to be associated with you. These are the kind of narratives that often exist within religions in many situations. That is the worst possible outcome, and why they're really conservative and terrible. Okay, given that, what are the outcomes of this? The important thing to note is there are significant differences in the way that people interact with religion when the focus is on personal piety rather than social and political issues. When they interact with personal piety, it's about the requirement is on the person who already ascribes to that religion. So the requirement is that I personally, as someone who believes in this religion, dictates the way that I personally should behave. And so I opt into that system and I say, this is how I am going to behave. And that means, firstly, that gives you a power, of feeling good when you do those, but also it means that other people aren't affected. Comparatively, when you focus on social and political issues, that necessarily means that you think that the religion has a moral imperative to focus beyond itself to the other people who don't ascribe to that religion. And it is the driving force of your religion. Because preaching has a lot of influence on what people think their moral forces, what they think the religion should be about. So necessarily you think that you always should be involved in other people's business in a case that is not the same when you focus on personal piety and what you personally yourselves are doing. I think that does three really terrible things. Firstly, it affects the way that you encourage your followers. You encourage them to lobby and advocate Christian right voting bloc in the United States has a massive amount of power over the way that the voting happens. Obviously, in an absence of the Christian right voting bloc, there would also be other types of right voting blocs. But firstly, we explained to you that the Christian vote is least able to change as opposed to other right-based systems. So even if there is another type of right bloc, that right bloc will be less able to change. But secondly, because it is rooted in religion, the followers of that religion believe it is their actual destiny, it is the thing that they need to do the most in the entire world. And what that means, they're able to put aside things like democracy. It looks at things like a tax on abortion clinics because they don't care about that to the same extent. Comparatively, when social and political things are rooted in political forces, that makes it much less likely that you have those kind of impacts. Secondly, when the state is grounded in religion, it means you codify those things into law, and it is extremely harmful. In a world where personal piety is the thing, there is no longer the same need for regulations. That looks like things like Modi in India trying to regulate in order to stop Muslim people from being able to do their thing. When the state has a mandate to do sweeping things which affect people's lives, that's really harmful. For example, I think in both worlds, maybe Christianity has views on contraception. But when the view is that it's a social and political issue, that is when you lead to laws which mean that no woman American can access contraception, as opposed to the Christians not being able to access it, which is far more harmful for the people who don't access that religion. No, often this means will affect the most vulnerable minorities who are the minority of the religion, because the state, the religions that have the most power over the state are firstly the ones that are the biggest, so therefore the most people, but secondarily, it means that, as I explained to you, the religions that have the most power are the ones who have been fucking over the poor and vulnerable people over time. So it's a self-fulfilling cycle where those people become poorer and more vulnerable. Finally, religions often have different conceptions, and so if there are different religions within a society which have a focus on social and political issues, that is what leads to far more conflict within those religions, because you see it as a battle over the character of your nation rather than a battle over your personal beliefs. And what that means, because you have more integration in the state, firstly, it means that the state itself makes it much harder to do actions. It means you're more likely to be able to, more likely to be able to get into gridlock. But secondly, you have active conflict between those groups. Look at a place like India, the Hindus and Muslims fight a lot over religion. Comparatively, groups like the Jainists and Buddhists don't have that kind of perception where it is about political and social issues. They believe it is much more a personal basis, and you get much less of that kind of conflict. The conflict is really harmful. At the worst scales, it looks like outspread religious war. It looks like border conflicts because you feel like you need to expand your political power outwards. It looks like a variety of different actions. But even on a smaller scale, it just looks like constant aggression within the people of your society, a lack of societal cohesion, even within politics itself, which is the thing that is most important, because that is what gives people the actions that the state must provide and protect them. Religions are socially conservative. They are a bad influence on society and politics. They should stay within their own home.
We prefer following a religion on either side of the debate. So note that they have to prove that this religion is going to be bad in so many cases that it outweighs the benefit of a person following the religion altogether, because that neglects all of the lovely things that religious movements have done for society. They led the civil rights movement, they led the backlash against apartheid, they organised food banks, they do all amazing things for the community that are very important for us to function as a society. Three things in this speech then. Firstly, on setup. Secondly, on why this is better for individuals, and thirdly, why this is better at the state level. Firstly, on setup, two things to note. One, what does piety mean, and what does it mean to look at that religion compared to social and political issues, or a religion that follows that? Firstly, on piety, two things to note. One is that this is an inward look, right? So you not only look at yourself and whether you're following religious doctrines or following the purity of that doctrine closely, but you also judge people based on whether they are pure to that doctrine. And so that means that all of their judgment material is pretty symmetrical, right? Because religious people, regardless of what religion they believe in, have an incentive to want to convert other people to their own religion. They apply their values outwardly, regardless of whether that focus is on personal piety or whether it is on social and political issues. So we think that, they needed to do more to prove that that was exclusive in the debate. But secondly, on social and political issues, we think that the difference between the religion is one, that they still have foundational values that they care about sharing around society. So it's things like loving thy neighbour, things like, caring about your fellow man. But secondly, we think that these are very general values because your religion has to be an agreement, and so that means that they aren't necessarily going to be values that attack people, but insofar as they are, we think that those values exist in the other religion regardless, because if your community is conservative and your religion is a reflection of that community, it's unlikely that either side is going to be able to stop things that happen. So this debate therefore looks like following forms of Christianity that focus on enforcing very strict standards of godliness, strict standards of pureness, versus following sects of Christianity that are focusing on looking outwardly and helping the community and changing the world in what you perceive to be positive ways. So moving now to why it is that it's better at the individual level. Note that at this point though, it's important to weigh why this is incredibly important, because most people have the most connection with religion at an individual level. It's how they think every day about themselves, it's how they think every day about their outlook on life. So if we can prove that people feel better about themselves and aren't so hateful, that means that we're able to win the debate. Why is it better on our side? Firstly, people are social creatures. So if they are, instead of forcing purity on others and purity on themselves, thinking about how they can, help the world and make the world a better place, that means that they're able to interact with people in a way that is better and at least slightly more neutral. But secondly, individuals are able to influence religion. So even insofar as religion is conservative, we think that they're going to be able to better influence and think about the relevance or the need for their religion to change if they think that their religion is based in evolving social and political rights. So that is why on our side you're able to have sects of Christianity that want to change the fact that there's segregation in America, or change the fact that there's apartheid in South Africa, because they understand that the fundamental values of caring and loving others is not reflective of the actual policy that the government is enforcing. Whereas on their side, you have to stand by the fact that people will look at themselves and look at others through the perspective of whether they are godly, and that is more likely to justify awful policies. So on their side, you also have the awful outcome that people will look at themselves through the lens of whether they are meeting the unrealistic standards of this religion. And so I tell you in setup that these standards are likely to be quite aspirational and quite aspirational towards purity. And so that means the outcome is that if they aren't fitting in with the social values of the time, they're likely to hate themselves and look inwardly rather than look outwardly and think about how they're going to discuss that with the community. They're unlikely to be able to change anything on their side. So that means on their side, the individual following religion is more likely to be hateful of themselves or unlikely to be able to be accepting of the community. Secondly, they're looking at why this is better at the state level. We tell you that we can also win the debate if we prove to you that society is a comparatively nicer place to live in. Because again, religion exists on either side of this debate. It's about what kind of religion we prefer. We tell you that religions are a force for good in multiple ways. Firstly, I told you about those fundamental values. But secondly, the key mechanism here is that uniquely these religions motivate people to act on their values in a way that is very effective. So it looks like coordination with each other, having a shared common message, having a shared idea that they want to change something about the world. And that looks like at a small level wanting to fix poverty, wanting to alleviate suffering by having food banks, but it can also look like at a large level trying to end apartheid or large-scale policies. Why is this an incredibly good thing? Firstly, because in the absence of this will to look outwardly for social and political change, you are unable to motivate or you're unable to coordinate in a way that actually achieves that change. If you look inwardly, you're unlikely to have that large-scale level of outlook on life. You are unable to do things like, establish a civil rights movement. But secondly, that also means that you have no advocacy on the small level. You're unlikely to be able to smart small communities that collects together and is able to help people in that community. The comparative is on their side. What you're likely to do at that state level is look outwardly towards judgment. You have less empathy because if you're measuring your life or your worth on piety and other people aren't meeting that standard that you have set for them, you do not have the same level of empathy for them. And that's when you get the worst forms of racism and judgment and abortion bans on their side, because you believe that other people aren't meeting the standards or aren't meeting the level of godliness that you have set for yourself. On the comparative, if you eventually believe that social and political change is an important message, you're more likely to be able to change, you're more likely to be willing to discuss how your religion applies to policy. That means not only do individuals feel better about their faith, it means at the societal level you're able to collectivize and advocate in a way that is beneficial.
Maybe the resistance to apartheid was driven by the South African Episcopal Church, but apartheid itself was rooted in the Dutch Reformed Church doctrine written 300 years prior that told people that black people were inferior and that white people needed to be kept separate, and that everywhere else in the world had moved on from and realized it was fucked and every other country had moved on from, but because the Dutch Reformed Church remained in its ironclad grip, refused to change the things that had been written hundreds of years ago because it thought they were a source of divine truth, that problem persisted longer and it was much worse. I'm going to do three things in my speech. Firstly, I'm going to deal with the material about personal piety making its followers sad, explain firstly why it's untrue, but secondly why I don't care about it. Secondly, I'm going to tell you why it is particularly likely that religions skew conservative. Note that Lucy has essentially already done most of this material. I don't think it's been well responded to. Then finally, I'm going to explain why regardless of what doctrine they follow, but especially if they are paleo-conservative, religions trying to influence how people engage in society and policy issues is really, really bad. Firstly then, on personal piety. I think the core thrust of the case first here is that religions tell people that they need to focus on themselves, but then set really difficult and unattainable barriers for them to reach, which makes those people permanently feel unfulfilled and like they're failing, and that is very bad for them. But I don't think that it is intuitive that this would be true, right? Think about the different ways a religion might pitch itself if it is personally focused or outwardly focused. If the pitch is, we are an outwardly focused religion, you can set really high, unattainable, difficult standards for society, because that gets everyone on board being like, oh yeah, the kids these days, this is fucked, and nothing about that. But if the pitch is, you are terrible, fuck you, you need to change all of this stuff, no one will want to get on board. That's why lots of people have stopped attending church regularly, because it makes them feel sad. I think that those kind of messages either are unsustainable, so those religions lose their influence and stop being successful and don't matter very much, or more likely, the religions just don't pitch that kind of stuff. They pitch much more attainable things. The kind of things that Melissa talks about, where they say, oh, if you care and love your neighbor and Jesus forgave all of these criminals, then, as long as you show up to church and focus on saying 100 Hail Marys every week, you'll be able to meet the bar and it'll be achievable. Because they want to set something that is achievable for those people to meet if them meeting it is the only thing that they are focusing on, otherwise they would feel the religion was pointless. I think that instead, setting high standards that make people upset and that they feel need to have action is only something that is useful when you're trying to galvanize people for how they act towards the rest of society. The second part is, and then you look at other people and they're not meeting the standard and that makes you judge them. I think maybe you judge them, but it's unclear why that is particularly harmful given that people judge other people all the time for a number of reasons, like the panel is doing to me right now. I think the difference between a social political focus and an inward focus is the inward focus type religions, things like Jainism and Buddhism, accept that other people won't follow the correct path and say that's fine because we will go to heaven and that's okay because we're worried about us. So you don't try and change those people because your pastor hasn't been telling you since you were 6 that you need to give them gay conversion conversion therapy to save them. You don't really care about them, so you let them live their lives. The alternative is in the social political side, when you're told that you have to save these people because you can't get into heaven unless you make them save themselves. That is much more harmful in the way people act on that. Finally then, on whether you care about this. A couple of things. Basically, our case is it harms other people who don't follow the religion. In their case, it harms people who do follow the religion. A, you can choose whether or not to follow a religion. Maybe it's not perfect free choice, but I still care about people who don't have a choice whether they are born as a minority in a Christian country or not. I care about those people more because they're not opting into it. But secondly, the motion says of all the religions in the world, we prefer the set of them that do not focus on these things that go and harm other people. Obviously, both sets will exist on both sides of the debate, but I prefer the ones that aren't going out and creating wider harms that permeate to the rest of society. It's not about which one you would personally prefer to follow. Now, let's talk about the conservatism. Essentially, Lucy brings you a wealth of material, and the response is, oh, but they want to appeal to people. I think that people generally, particularly older people, might like to lean into some conservative values if they're given a justification they don't have to rationalize because it's just God said it, so it's true, and it's been done this way for a long time. Note that means they probably skew more conservative than other factors that exist in society. But the second thing is, religions are likely to evolve to meet the standards of the day because they want to stay relevant. I think that Lucy explains why the exact opposite is true. Because unlike political and social organizations that are the alternative that might shape people's views, they uniquely don't have to do that and are incentivized not to because their only source of legitimacy is that they are really old and have an original text that was apparently read a long time ago. I think that's why, literally, Hinduism tells about 30% of people in India that they're in an untouchable caste that needs to be persecuted and kept out of society, and no other conceivable political force could afford to alienate that larger proportion of the population or work in that way. But finally, let's talk about the way people engage on those things, even if you don't think they're more conservative. Lucy tells you that when you think you are divinely ordained to go and make social and political change, you don't just vote in the election for it. You do things like blow up abortion clinics or have like sectarian riots in the slums of Mumbai. Those kill people. That is extremely harmful, even if it was for a good cause. And I think that is quite bad, because you are motivated by a different calculus than you would be by simply, oh, this is a good change in society, so we should work by it, right? The second thing we hear is, oh, but they'll try and make this change for everyone regardless because all religions want to convert people. But it's not actually true that all religions want to convert people. Religions like Judaism, Jainism, and Buddhism actively don't go out and proselytize. Proselytization is relatively unique to social and political movements because that's what they need to achieve their goals. But when personal piety is all you care about, you focus on yourselves, you leave everyone else alone. We should just do that.
I'd like to offer up the second member. Firstly, on the unresponded to largest harm in this debate about the massive anxiety that the 7 billion religious people in the world feel that they do not believe they have met the standard of piety and are not going to get infinite salvation. And then on what religions push for. In terms of the harms of personal piety, the only thing that we hear in response is that the standards are not going to be particularly high because religions want to ensure that all people feel that religion is accessible. But obviously, people act fearfully because religion is telling you in most cases that you either are going to get infinite utility if you do good things and go to heaven or the equivalent, or you're going to get infinite damnation if you do not meet the standard. And that means that all people in religion, clearly the largest group, feel far more anxious. This impacts their day-to-day life. This is the largest harm. It applies to all individuals, and it means that individuals, every moment is far worse. They cannot weigh this out by saying that this is less important because clearly it does impact the way that individuals act. But importantly, this anxiety means that the types of harms that they say about people acting in particularly conservative ways when you have the anxiety that you've not met your standard of personal piety, that is when you are most likely to want to act irrationally and to force your religious beliefs onto others. Because as Melissa explains, personal piety isn't just about believing that you have met that standard. It is also about recognizing that others have not and believing that they are a bad person for that. When you have that anxiety that you yourself are not as pious as possible because you have not been able to spread the word of God, you have not been able to convert as many individuals as possible, that is when you are most likely to do the most extreme actions they want to talk about. That is when you are most likely to want to go up to gay people and criticize them. That is when you are most likely to want to protest in front of abortion clinics. And clearly those are the largest harms because states are far more regulated by other international actors, by things like the UN and human rights laws. Individuals are not, however, and that allows for them to cause the most extreme harms. That allows for them to cause the things that most directly harm individuals. That is important, and they were insufficient in engaging with this. Next, on what religions push for. They have an absolute lack of nuance in their characterization, because there is not just one type of religion. There are the two religions that Melissa explains. There are majority religions, and which are already and those, if they are conservative, those policies are already implemented anyway, because those people are conservative for other reasons. They are conservative for social and economic factors in their state, and so there is very little change under their side. However, what we uniquely explain is that minority religions are the best way to empower individual groups and to mobilize them in order to get them change. Let's then dive deeper into conservative religions that are about the majority group in countries, and explain why the changes, why the harmful policies that they want to talk about are not a change in this debate, and therefore cannot help them win. The first thing I would note is that obviously religions are influenced by the people, as Melissa explains. Peter tells you that that is not true, and that not all religions want to convert individuals. Obviously, that is a mitigatory response. But also, everybody does, because you want to make all others follow the word of God. But even if you don't believe that specific reason, they don't engage with the other reason we give, which is that religions want to have as many individuals in their society, in their religion, in order to get tithing. And that explains that these religions are influenced by the people rather than the people being influenced by religions. And so, conservative religions are only conservative because the people were already conservative. The majority of people in this country were already conservative. And you can look to the fact that there are many liberal religions in places that are liberal. This looks like German Catholics that are far more liberal than other sects. This looks like Anglicans that allow female pastors that are fine with abortion. And that explains that the harms that they want to talk about are entirely symmetric in this debate, because those religions that are pushing those messages are only pushing those messages to try to attract people that are already conservative, people that already exist in that state, people that have already voted against gay marriage, people that have already voted for abortion. And these churches are just trying to get them to join their religion because that is their strongest incentive. And that means the harms that they talk about fall out of this debate because they are entirely symmetric. However, what is not symmetric is the mobilization that minority religions are able to get. This is incredibly important because it leads to massive impacts like Melissa talks about. Black churches that were able to lead the civil rights movement, the Philippines Catholic Church being able to overthrow Marcos. It leads to apartheid being overturned. And this is not symmetric because minority individuals do not have no other strong form of mobilization. They do not have the voting power to implement the policies that they want, like conservative majority religions do, like I explained in my past set of analysis. And so these individuals necessarily have to use religion as the best way to mobilize. These people are time and resource poor because they are oppressed groups. They need a strong message. They need a message from God in order to be able to do this. And that is the type of good social change that is not symmetric in this debate. What you should believe at the end of this is that the large harms that they talk about are entirely symmetric because religions are influenced by the people. However, what is not symmetric is the change that individuals from minority religions are able to get through mobilization, as that is the only way that they are able to enact their power, and importantly, that all individuals are harmed from the anxiety of not thinking that you have been pious enough and pushing that onto other individuals.
The case is contingent on you believing an unrealistic depiction of what it means to follow a pious religion, and that is that you only care about yourself and your own purity. But that is not the case, right? You care about your daughter's purity when she's having premarital sex. You care about your friend's purity when they come out as gay. That is when you start to judge people and do things that are incredibly hateful. You don't have that fundamental understanding that views can change, ideas can evolve. That is the exclusive benefit that we get on their side. Because Lucy's case was symmetrical, right? Religions are old regardless. Religions are conservative regardless. They're a reflection of their community. So the unique harm that remains in this debate is what we proved to you in my speech, which was that first, people feel a lot less anxious when they are not judging themselves and judging others. They're caring about social and political change. And secondly, society is a better place when at the small scale you have people motivated to do food banks, and at the large scale you get segregation ending because there is a method in which people can mobilize. Two things in the speech then. Firstly, we won on the individual level, and secondly, where we won on the societal level. Firstly, on individuals. They claim that the piety standards are not that high, but we gave you two responses that we're not engaged with. Firstly, they need to be aspirational, because this is about eternal salvation, right? It's not something that people can just tick off a box, because then they're not motivated to follow religion for the rest of their lives. So that means that people keep aspiring towards a standard, and in the process of not being good enough, they feel guilty. They apply that guilt to other people. They feel awful about themselves. And that means that they're more likely to feel really, really awful on their day-to-day lives on their side of the debate. But secondly, even if you believe that this standard is attainable, Rob explains to you people that don't apply that standard to themselves and others rationally, because they're anxious about eternal damnation. They're anxious about the peer pressure of not following those standards. That mother is not acting out of rationalness when she's abusing her daughter for having premarital sex. She's anxious that she's going to go to hell and that she's not going to be able to save her. That means that people are going to have a really awful life. The impact is incredibly large, right? Because it means that people of colour, gay people, anyone that doesn't fit the mold hates themselves eternally. That's billions of people. The scale and depth of that impacting was never engaged with, and it's why we win the debate. On the comparative, change happens. Even if at the base level people are conservative and they hate people of colour and they hate other religions, we think at least that there's a possibility for these religions to evolve on our side, because churches are engaged in that political discussion. They're willing, they're open to have a discussion and this preaching moments. Secondly then, when we extend the margin wars on society, they tell you that everyone's conservative and that makes these religions bad. But I've already proven to you that that's harm is symmetrical, right? And that there's nothing that they can change about religion. So note that the exclusive mechanisms that we gave you, that weren't the symmetrical ones that Lucy gave you, were that people are more likely to evolve out of that conservatism when they have an output focus and they're engaged in the political atmosphere. They tell you that you're more likely to act on aggression and push for change on their side. But we tell you and flip that when we tell you that if you're aspiring towards piety, and that means you're placing unrealistic standards on people, that's when you're more likely to blow up an abortion clinic, because you're irrational. You want people to be really, really pure, but when they don't achieve that standard, you can't reconcile it with the fact that political change can be achieved and other mechanisms. We get mobilization, segregation still remains on their side of the debate.
shit about yourselves, the same regardless of whether the religion liberalizes over time. Because if the only material is true and you want to make sure there's a really high standard, even if it's the case that contact with political change liberalizes you to some extent, you're still incentivized to keep the bar being really high. So if all demonization is true, I just don't know why it changes. They make people feel like shit on either side. But we explained to you that actually religions have an incentive to not make people feel like shit in the majority of cases, and that is true on either side of the house. And the reason for that is the exact same material that Melissa and Rob give you, which is that you need to encourage people to have an aspirational view of the religion where they feel like they can reach salvation. So if you make it an impossible pathway where you're able to basically fuck yourself, they make it so that you're never able to be involved in that religion. Obviously, you're going to have pathways for people to seek redemption on either side of the house. And this overwhelming anxiety that they talk about is directly counter to whatever the religion's aims are. That anxiety material falls out of the debate. Secondly, on societal change. I think what we explained to you down the line is that helping people makes most people feel good, and they will unite to do that regardless of religion or not, in a variety of different ways as they have over time. Uniting under ethical, philosophical, moral, political considerations rather than religious ones. Note that things like the civil rights movements had those components in them anyway. So the counterfactual is on our side is that the civil rights movement just unites under a political and philosophical standing rather than a religious one. The question then in this debate is what narrative you think people should decide to help others. We tell you that when religions tell you what doing good means in a social and political sense, firstly, that sense is likely to be far more conservative and far more based in what was like in the past. And even if they do liberalise to some extent, they still are most likely going to be more conservative. But secondly, we tell you they're less able to change over time than the counterfactual, which is a political unitedness. Things like the apartheid movement, which Peter talks about you, and the Dutch Reformed Church, you get trapped and you're less able to change it. Finally, you're less able, thirdly, you're not able to be influenced by other changes when religion is your driving factor. So if you have a philosophical consideration or a moral or like other political consideration of how you think the world should be, you're more able to listen to other people and change. Comparatively, when religions tell you there is one unending truth, you're not able to change your opinion over time. Fourthly, the way you think about that salvation is likely to be less tangible. So you think the way that you help people in Africa is by going and like telling them not to use condoms, rather than actually giving them the aid that you might have, which is what the philosophical consideration would be. What are the outcomes of this? Firstly, religious people are both religious and non-religious people are directly harmed because the minority religious groups in that state, which often might be like 40% of the state, for example, of the state even, are harmed because they are told that their religion is wrong. They are told they are constrained by political laws which are driven by religion. The counterfactual they give is the judgment of others. But obviously, when the religion focuses on inwardness, it's never going to be the same as judgment. Even if judgment exists on either side of the house, we would rather that the dominant political force in societies is not religion. That's what they necessarily stand for, and it will always harm people in a way that we cannot stand for.